Tonight, Question Time has come to London. We're just a good brisk walk away from the banks of the River Thames inside LSO St Luke's, the beautiful building where the London Symphony Orchestra rehearse, record and perform. Our local audience members have been arriving in their numbers to face our panel and prepare their questions. And as a group, as usual, they reflect the general electoral picture across the nation. And tonight, as Labour accused the previous government of running an open borders experiment, just what is a sensible immigration policy? Welcome to Question Time. From the government is Lisa Nandy. She's the Cabinet Secretary for Culture, Media and Sport and has been the MP for Wigan since 2010. Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg was a Cabinet Minister under both Boris Johnson and Liz Truss and a leading light of the Brexit campaign. He's since lost his parliamentary seat, presents a weekly show on GB News and is about to star with his family in his own reality TV show. Mariella Frostrup has been a travel writer, agony aunt, arts critic and presenter of a variety of TV and radio shows. Having written a book and presented a documentary about the subject, she recently became the government's menopause employment ambassador. Rory Stewart was a deputy governor of 2 Iraqi provinces, worked in Afghanistan and taught at Harvard. He then served in the governments of David Cameron and Theresa May and even stood to be Conservative leader. He left the party completely over Brexit in 2019 and now presents one of the country's leading podcasts with Alistair Campbell. And Professor Anand Menon is the director of UK in a Changing Europe. That's the wide-ranging body of academics who study the issues facing the UK, its place in the world and its relationship with the EU. Good evening. Welcome to our panellists. Welcome to our audience here at LSO St Luke's. Great to see you and welcome, of course, to you at home. You can join in the programme in the usual ways on social media and don't forget we're on BBC iPlayer and BBC Sounds as well. Right, it's been quite a week. Let's kick off with our first question, which is from Ben Buxton.
Good evening. Is Prime Minister Keir Starmer right in saying the Conservatives were running an open borders experiment?
So, Ben, this is what Keir Starmer said today in response to the revised net migration figures. In the year to June 23, they were not far short of 1 million. They have come down by 20% in the following year, but they are much higher than was thought originally. Jacob, as the person who was in that government, were you running an open borders experiment?
No, there was not an open borders experiment, but immigration policy failed. And it failed very badly, and it failed to do what the British people had wanted.
So when Robert Jenrick, who is now Shadow Justice Secretary and was a former immigration minister, said today is a day of shame for the Conservative Party, the public are right to be furious. Do you agree?
Yes, I agree with him, and as a Conservative, let me apologise to people. We failed, and we were culpable for that because we were in charge. There are all sorts of reasons why we failed.
So what went wrong?
What went wrong? Partly it was a response to COVID, and there was a feeling that it was going to be very hard to find people to fill jobs. Partly it was the way that economic growth was scored by the ABR, and it was thought that migration would boost growth and would allow the tax revenues to rise and to pay for public services that people want. Partly a new system was being brought in which allowed too many people to come in.
Post-Brexit?
Well, it was a post-Brexit system. We had control. The terrible thing is that we had control. We do now have control of our numbers.
So what do you think,
and we let far too many people in?
As someone who was a strong proponent of Brexit, that the figures for net migration were lower pre-Brexit than post-Brexit?
Well, hold on. They were completely wrong pre-Brexit. So,
are you disputing that they were lower?
Well, the figures, let me just explain. The pre-Brexit figures, it was thought that about 2 million people would register as a right to stay here post-Brexit. The figure was over 5 million when it was finally created. So for years, the ONS was giving us wrong figures on the people coming from the European Union. So yes, I do dispute that they were low beforehand because they were simply wrong. There were an extra 3 million plus people who had come in who no one was recording. So we then introduced a system that initially, of course, we had COVID, so small numbers came in. Immediately after COVID, there was this economic concern about destruction of labour in the domestic market, and it simply got wildly out of control. Rishi Sunak, to his credit, began to tighten it up at the end of his period, but nothing like enough. We now have the ability, and I hope the Labour government will do this, to bring immigration down to the under hundreds of thousands a year, below 100,000 itself.
Lisa, as a government representative on the panel, I'm sure you agree with Keir Starmer and his criticism of the previous government. Let's talk about your government.
Sure.
What are you going to be doing
I'm
to
glad
bring
you
down
said
net
that, because
migration
I think
numbers?
we've had a debate going on in the Conservative Party about their own record, but what I'm much more interested in is how we fix the problems that we inherited. And I wanted to say from the outset that my dad was an immigrant to this country. I grew up in Manchester, a city that, like London, has been shaped by immigrants and defined by immigrants and enriched by immigrants as well over the years. But I think the problem really arose when you got arbitrary targets that were set every single year, missed every single year. You had people profiting from human misery in the Channel with the small boat crossings that just felt completely
Well, that's
out of
also
control.
illegal migration, but when you look at legal migration, the figure is extremely high.
But you also had what I think was really the shameful part of this, that over the years it became an excuse not to invest in young people here. How could it possibly be that for 10 years, over 10 years, nursing was on the shortage occupation list, which meant that people were being recruited from overseas, but nobody in government thought, hang on a minute, why aren't we putting together a workforce plan so that we can skill up young people in our country to fill those vacancies? In my town, in Wigan, we're immensely proud that people come from all over the world to help treat us in our National Health Service. But I have kids who are growing up just a few yards from the hospital who've seen that whole ladder of opportunity dismantled, and they could no more dream of getting a job in that hospital than they could dream of going to the moon. We are absolutely determined that that is going to change. That's why we've linked labour shortages, migration and skills together, so that the Migration Advisory Committee doesn't just look at where the skills shortages are, it has to look at where we've got ongoing skills shortages and come up with a proper plan for how we're going to skill up young people in order to be able to get those jobs.
Let's talk about the NHS, for example. So I hear what you say about skilling up more NHS staff. You've got something like 20% of NHS staff at the moment are non-UK nationals. So when it comes to that sector, presumably we're going to have to wait some time for migration figures to come down when it comes to the NHS or social care, where again there's a sizable number come from outside the UK, because it takes time to train these people. Well, so should we just have to accept these migration figures are going to be high for a while?
No, I think, look, there's lots of different ways that we're tackling this. But the NHS workforce plan that we put forward before the election, that we've already cracked on with delivering, is starting to show real results. We've also got...
Yeah, but it takes years to train up.
We've also got people that we're attracting back into the workforce. Liz Kendall this week announced a plan to get over 50s in particular back into work. We've got lots of people on sickness pay as we improve the National Health Service. We make it much, much easier for them to have a glide path back into work. And it isn't just the National Health Service where we've got shortages. Got shortages right across the board in engineering, in really critical skills. And we've got young people desperate to get those opportunities. 1 million of them not in education, work or training. That is a national scandal, and any government worth its salt will be doing something about it, and that's why we are.
Let's hear from our audience. Yes, the man there in the front.
For me, the question is less in terms of the numbers, as opposed to whether it is a successful integration within society, and whether there is a successful melting pot that is going on here in the UK and, quite frankly, in the rest of Europe. And I would argue that it's not. So, you know, we can play around in terms of the numbers and who's responsible and who's not. But I think the more important issue is, are we looking at a successful migration strategy that, by example, people that come into the UK embrace British values, seek those British values, become part of the melting pot of what is the UK.
And do you think that's not happening at the moment?
I believe it is not happening.
Okay. The man just a little bit further along. Yes, with the glasses.
We seem to talk about legal migration as a negative, and I think in some time we need to take a step back and actually look at our workforce and who's actually going to replace the workforce. Where's the workforce going to come in our NHS and some of the types of sectors that migration has actually helped this country? And from everything I read, the biggest way to grow our economy is through migration and immigration. So we need to have an answer for this rather than saying that's the problem but not a solution.
Okay, and the woman in the black sleeveless sweater there. Yeah.
I think as a migrant who works hard, pays tax, contributes to the economy, kind of hearing, as a gentleman in front said, that legal migration is a bad thing is actually quite disheartening. And I think you know, we haven't got enough nurses, we haven't got enough doctors, but we've got amazing people overseas who want to come, support, work, and that is somehow a negative when we need those people right now.
Rory.
There's no doubt that we desperately, desperately need immigration for a whole series of sectors. Health, social care, and also we're not having enough children in Britain. Our population's actually declining. When the welfare state was set up, there were 20 working people for every one retired person. Today, there are fewer than 3 working people for every one retired person in Britain. But it's also true that our immigration policy is a complete disaster. We can both celebrate the contribution of immigrants and point out that something very strange is happening. We've gone from a situation where for nearly 50 years the numbers were under 100,000, and we've just jumped in 5 years to 700,000, almost 1 million. There's absolutely no reason for that, and one of the biggest problems that we're not talking about is only 1/3 of those visas are for work. 2/3 of people are coming on student visas, family visas, or they're coming in for refugee and asylum status. And we have to deal with this because the thing that's driving far-right groups all the way across Europe, undermining democracy, is the perception that we don't have control of immigration. So we can be humane, we can be liberal, we can be welcoming, we can say that immigration is vital for our economy, but we have to demonstrate that we have a working system. And the Conservatives failed, and I fear Labour's going to fail too.
Anand?
I mean, let me just start with the gentleman in the front who talked about integration. I actually think, compared to most European countries, we do quite well when it comes to the integration of immigrants in this country. We could do better. I mean, the last government cut the amount of funding for English language training for immigrants, for instance. So I think we can always do better, and there are areas of our life where we can do better to get people integrated. On the question, on Ben's question, I think Keir Starmer was wrong. I think he was wrong on a very basic level, because this isn't uncontrolled open borders immigration. This is government policy. A very small fraction of those coming in are the small boats. Let me leave those to one side and just talk about the people coming in visa routes. We have a lot of people coming in visa routes, and we might say the number is too high. Then you've got to decide, OK, which ones would you do without? A lot of that spike in numbers was Hong Kongers, who we opened our doors to because of what was happening in China, and we said, you can come here. OK, you're British nationals overseas. A lot of them were Ukrainians because of the war going on in Ukraine. We let a lot of Ukrainians into this country and they bumped up the numbers. A lot of them are students, and you can say, OK, we have too many foreign students. If you have fewer foreign students, someone needs to answer the question, who pays for our universities? Because foreign students pay a higher fee than domestic students. And when you come to care, when you come to the NHS, I think it is absolutely the case that in the care sector, a lot of people came over as migrants who were frankly just exploited, quite often for jobs that didn't exist. So I think better enforcement of employment rights is absolutely crucial. But even there, if we don't have those people coming, we need to ask questions about who is going to staff our social care homes, who is going to staff our hospitals. And
So Anand, when you have pretty much unanimity from parties saying we all think the number is too high, do you not agree with that?
Well, I think the question isn't whether... I mean, everyone can have their own opinion about what the right number is. I personally think setting a number is ridiculous because there are too many unknowns about wars, about what happens to our economy. Numbers are random, and having a random number for immigration might make you feel better, but actually you're probably just going to fail. What I think is crucial is that you're honest and you say, OK, look, we want to bring immigration down. There are going to be some trade-offs around the margins. It might be some universities go under. It might be that actually we're going to have to deal with the fact that, you know, on social care, the obvious way of reconciling the problem in social care is to pay social care workers significantly more. But the one thing we're all aware of is there is no cash. OK, we're very tight on money at the moment. So be honest about the difficult choices and debate them on the back of that, I would say.
All right. Yes. Man there in the check shirt.
Fully support legal migration, but it seems the government is spending millions and millions on empty hotels trying to fight the illegal immigration. Surely if you divert those funds to healthcare, training nurses, that kind of thing, why can't you just redistribute those funds for better for the taxpayer?
All right. The woman in the black cardie. Yes, that's you.
There was a comment that was made about lots of people who are striving for the opportunities that are available in terms of nursing, but how capable are those people to take them up in terms of their education? Because if they're not educated enough to take up those roles and people are coming in to take those, then are we really asking the right question? Because education starts at home, and if you're not building up people with that education system to take up those roles that you know that are open, then you can't fault people for bringing in that quality where they need it from outside.
Okay, and the man behind you in the white short-sleeved shirt.
We need a long-term plan. 30, 40 years, as Rory has said, we have a declining birth rate, as do most developed countries. We have an ageing population. Where are our workers going to come from if we are not producing new workers? We also haven't talked about the foreign policy. We need to have a good foreign policy to make the push factors that are bringing migrants to this country from other countries less bad for those young people and for those migrants. It's mainly young people who migrate. And we haven't even begun to think about climate change and the environmental refugees and the people who are going to be forced to move through climate change in the next 50, 60, 100 years.
Mariella.
I think first and foremost, what it appears as a layperson is that there's total chaos around immigration policy. You know, obviously we need to stop criminal gangs from profiting from desperate people trying to get to the UK or anywhere else. Today, I think there was the announcement of a returns agreement with Iraq, and actually the returns agreement with Albania proved incredibly positive in terms of how it changed numbers.
But of course, these are people who, illegal migrants, for want of a better term, and there's something like, was it 31,000 people or something, between 30 and 40,000, which is a tiny fraction.
Absolutely, but it made a big impact on the statistics for the small boat crossings, which are the ones that generally tend to appear on the headlines of newspapers most of the time, as though we're being invaded by an army of migrants, which I would dispute if you look at those numbers. And of course we need efficient enforcement in terms of processing claims, because again, how do you get here legally? It's very, very difficult if you're struggling. And we have signed up to all kinds of international agreements because we want to protect people and we want to allow people to come to this country who are in dire need. But for me, the biggest issue is the toxic narrative around migrants that's existed particularly over the last sort of decade or so, and demonising people as being other, whether they're Europeans and we don't want to be a part of Europe, or they're from further afield.
And are you blaming people like Jacob for that?
You know, I came here at 16.
Mariella, are you blaming people like Jacob for that?
I don't blame individuals, but I blame of what I consider to be a very toxic narrative. I think politicians have treated the whole migrant issue as a political football. I think we talk about numbers instead of people. You know, any of us could be in those unfortunate situations, particularly those who are escaping from war, famine at the moment in Sudan and so on. And I just think we need to have a healthier idea of compassion and empathy, which I think as Britons we always have been. And I think to the gentleman's point about, you know, people integrating, what makes it really hard for people to integrate is if their neighbours are being told that these people are the enemy, that they're coming here and scamming off people and doing
Woman in the green dress.
I think what people don't do is talk about what's the quality of migration. You know, things are very emotive. People throw out big numbers, but I think politicians and the press need to stop treating this audience and the nation and dumbing down the conversation. So as a finance person, what I would want to know is not just the numbers, but what are these people contributing? Are people, you know, I'm first-generation immigrant and I pay over 50% in taxes, which is a lot of money. But, you know, or are people more becoming a burden on social services? Because if we can't afford to look after people who are already on the housing queue and, you know, having children benefits, having even more people coming in. And I think that's the difference, is that it's not really about the numbers, it's about whether people are contributing or not.
Rory, you want to come back in?
I think one of the risks here is that we get into a debate where, on the one hand, people are essentially talking about letting people in and being humane and appreciating the contribution of immigrants, and on the other hand, you have a sense that people opposing it are xenophobic racists. I think the answer has to be that governments need to be serious. They need to be what I would call loving strict. They need to find a way of showing that immigrants contribute hugely. We have a massive obligation to share the burden of asylum seekers with other countries around the world and do our part. But we are in control. And if we don't, if we just talk around it and pose as nice people, we can see what's happening in Europe. Fascist parties winning in states in Germany, the far right winning in the Netherlands, the far right winning in Austria, and Donald Trump just winning an entire election by talking about immigration. All he wanted to talk about. So for people like me who passionately want to save the centre ground of politics, we need to have a statement about controlling immigration as part of our message.
But don't we also have to talk about the positivity that people bring? Because that's the thing. You get people arguing constantly about, you know, numbers and who should be allowed in and you know, whether we need the skills. But you don't actually get, as the lady just mentioned there, a conversation about the economic benefits of people coming to this country and actually challenging the narratives that people like Donald Trump and the right-wing leaders in other parts of Europe are you know, benefiting from.
But isn't the danger, Rory, that you can't combat the far right by pandering to them and simply adopting their rhetoric? And there is a danger, isn't there, that you simply buy that rhetoric on. I mean, the fact is, we have a very muddled, confused and misleading debate about immigration, where, you know, there are genuine concerns about numbers, fine. There's genuine concern about the economics of it as well. I just think simply saying, yes, immigration, we need to control it and we are going to be tough.
But that's exactly not what I'm saying. I'm saying we need immigration. Immigrants contribute hugely to our country. It's desperately important for demographics, for our health service, for our businesses. But we also need to control it. And if we fail to say that, the populist far right is going to win in Britain, as it is across most of the Western world.
All right, I'm going to park this subject here for now. I'm sure we will revisit it. Before I get on to our next question, let me just tell you where we are next week, which is Lincoln in the East Midlands. Let me tell you who we've got on. We'll have the former Home Secretary, now Education Minister, Jackie Smith. We've got Kevin Hollinrake from the Conservatives. We have your good friend, and Tony Blair's former spin doctor, Alistair Campbell, and the leader of Reform UK, Nigel Farage. That should be an interesting programme. Listen to the sort of noise. I'll try to work out what that noise means from you all. The week after that, we're in Beckenham in South London. So Lincoln, then Beckenham. If you want to be on either, come and be in the audience for either programme, go to the Question Time website and hopefully we will see you on the night. OK, our next question now from Rahim Shamji.
Good evening. If we don't have a choice about when we are born, should we have a choice about when we die?
So, of course, you're referring to the assisted dying bill that is going through Parliament at the moment. It's due for a second reading tomorrow. Will it survive that to go on to a third and possibly legislation? We shall see. Rory.
I was in Parliament, like Jacob, and I guess like Lisa, when this came up last time.
It was 2015.
The thing that worries me most is that we have a very, very expensive adult social care system. And it's crippling. I mean, people are bankrupting themselves looking after their elderly relatives. The other thing is that it's very, very common for, I think, all of us to experience friends who are elderly saying, I don't want to be a bother, I don't want to be a problem. If they feel that they are costing their families enormous amounts of money, if they feel that decent government palliative care is not available, I worry, particularly because people can be depressed, they can be suffering from complex problems, that they may make a choice which looks as though it's a free choice, but where there is a whole series of hidden pressures going behind it. So I fully understand. Of course, there are people dying in agony. It's horrible. But that has to be weighed up against the fact that we have, for 2,000 years, had very, very deep intuitions about why doctors don't get involved in killing people.
I mean, they do in many countries around the world, as you know, and as far as I can find out, in none of those countries, some have been going since the 1940s, in none of those countries have they decided this isn't working because of coercion, for example, so let's rescind it.
Yeah,
so we are effectively, for them, we're an outlier.
I think that's right. I think the figures, though, in places like the Netherlands are quite startling. The numbers that are going through this are quite startling. And I wonder when you've implemented it, how much willingness there really is to look at what we mean by coercion. I mean, obviously you can catch somebody literally being forced by a relative, but the subconscious motivations that might mean in the last 6 months of your life, you begin to think, well, maybe I'm being a bit of a bother. This is a pretty miserable experience. I think those things are more difficult to catch.
Okay.
Yeah.
Lisa.
So I appreciate that there are really heartfelt views and well thought out views on all sides, and I'm not pretending that this is easy or straightforward for a moment, but what I would say to Rory is that, you know, the bill that is being put forward for us to consider on Friday, and we will consider it if it passes on Friday. There's still a lot of stages to go, a lot of members of Parliament to make up their minds, and there may well be some changes to that legislation as a result of that debate. But the bill that has been put forward puts forward a system in which you have to be over the age of 18 in order to apply for the right to get assistance to end your life. You have to have a terminal diagnosis within 6 months that you're expected to die. You've got to apply to an independent doctor for an assessment. You've then got to go to a second doctor for a second assessment. And you've then got to reflect and decide whether you want to apply to a judge for an order to be able to do that. I think it is a very thoughtful system that is designed to try to avoid precisely the problems that Rory is rightly highlighting. And I, as a constituency MP, I've seen far too many cases, and in my own family, of people who didn't have that choice or dignity at the end of their lives. And of course, it's very difficult for families, whatever decisions people want to make. But for so many families to watch their loved ones go through that, to not even be able to have the conversation with them, to not be able to offer any choice unless you happen to be very wealthy and have a lot of time to plan and be able to go overseas. I just think watching families live with those regrets for the rest of their lives is something that I don't want to see anybody else go through. And so I will be supporting the bill respectfully, with respect for the strength of feeling on all sides of the debate on Friday. I think that inaction has costs, and I think we've debated this for a very long time in this country. I think the time has come to make some decisions.
Okay. Man in the green sweater.
Thank you. So as society becomes more tolerant and secular, and I think this is one thing that has been derived originally from religion, do we not think that we should give people the dignity to decide in circumstances where they have the sanity to be able to, and also the tolerance to be able to put people out of their misery when they decide, and not necessarily to continue that where they're really suffering?
Okay, now, you never know who you're going to end up sitting next to in the audience. I noticed the person next to you has their hand out and you've got a dog collar on. So, and you refer to secular society. Let's hear your view.
I think it's a very difficult issue, and I've also been around people who have had a difficult death. I think we cross an ethical line when we put this bill through, and I think that devalues life. And having been somebody who was a carer for many, many years with somebody who was incredibly disabled, her quality of life was thought to be very low, but actually it was good. But you couldn't see that from the outside. And I know that medical practitioners would perhaps view her in a different light to the way she saw herself. And I think the issue here is that we're actually asking doctors to make decisions which in other circumstances we would call killing.
And so when you have someone like Esther Ranson, for example, who has campaigned for many things throughout her life, and as she reaches the end of her life, she is campaigning for the right for assisted dying, what would you say to her?
I would say that I think because she's very, very well known, and because she has a voice, she is
and
actually
because she's going through it, obviously she has a terminal illness.
She's going through it. But I think the answer is to recognise that if we can improve our palliative care, I agree with Wes Streeting on this. Palliative care, it shows that there is a value of the end of life, and there is a reason for life. And like the questioner said, we can't choose when we're born. Why do we have to have this issue of having control until right the moment we actually die?
Okay.
Because that's not given to all of us.
Man here in the jacket.
I have a religious take on it, although I think that needs to be alleviated, especially from what Lisa said in terms of the caveats that are placed. Because clearly, you're placing a lot of sort of caveats in terms of how someone can actually reach the end. My father had a very aggressive brain tumour, and if we didn't have the last 15 months with him, obviously we would have felt quite strongly about sort of losing him. But even at the end, you have that non-resuscitate. which is clearly a very
do
strong...
not resuscitate.
Yeah,
order.
do not resuscitate. Now, you can argue the toss whether that's a decision made by, medical staff, which clearly it is, or whether it's a decision that we made as a family. We were overridden, but we still had the 15 months. So you have to respect the fact that if someone has a glioblastoma, which is what he had, you have to respect the fact that he had that. He was going to pass. But again, I'm a Muslim, for example, but I wouldn't let that dictate someone else's choice or even someone in my family's choice.
So would you?
So
would you support this or not?
I would definitely support it, yeah, because I think because of what Lisa said, and it's not a political reason. I think all the reasons that she's added, the caveats are so strong that it's quite hard to not see any sense in those.
Jacob.
Let me preface my remarks by saying that I'm a Catholic and I believe in the teaching of the Catholic Church. And I believe that all life is precious, that we are all made in the image and likeness of God, all of us, including me, amazingly. And that is really very, very important. I don't think this is a decision that it is right to take. But I accept that a lot of people in this audience and in the country are not going to follow the teaching of the Catholic Church and will want to look at it for practical reasons. And this is where I think Rory's argument is so strong, and I'm deeply suspicious of the protections in the bill. If you take the first practical point, how easy is it to get an appointment with a GP? And we're told suddenly there will be 2 doctors available to sign things off. The High Court is overwhelmed with business. How much time is the judge going to be able to give to consider this?
I mean, you have got the former head of the Supreme Court who's backing this.
And you've got Jonathan Sumption who isn't, and says that there are problems with it. So you can quote all sorts of people doing different positions, but the High Court is overwhelmed, and if it's meant to be a rubber stamp, that's very dangerous. But Rory's point is the absolutely fundamental one. It's not pressure from rapacious relations, though those will exist. It is the internal pressure that people will put on themselves, the elderly and the frail. And the lives of the elderly and the frail are just as valuable as those of the healthy and the sprightly. And they will be saying, I'm a cost to the NHS. Do you remember when we all banged tin cans to say, save the NHS? We lived our lives. We locked ourselves up for months to save the NHS. How many people at that point would have thought, well, actually, I'll help the NHS if I don't live any longer? In 2020, 10% of the cost of inpatient care was on people in their last year of life. That's a very big saving. How many elderly people will say, if I died now, that would help my child or my grandchild buy a house, and I'm a burden, and I need care, and they've got to do this for me and that for me? It's not the pressure of the state. It's not the pressure of the family. It is that internal pressure that people will put on themselves, whereas now they don't have that choice. And I would strongly recommend Hugo Rifkin's amazing article in the Times today for people who are undecided on this matter. It was a very profound and touching article, I thought.
Man there in this stripy sweater.
Thank you. We're having this conversation at the same time as women's reproductive freedoms are under attack in the US, which people in this country, I can't speak on everyone's behalf, but generally are horrified by. Because as a country, we kind of stand by the right of a woman to make decisions about her own body. So why then would we not apply that same logic to individuals with terminal illnesses who are in great pain and allow them to make informed decisions about their own bodies, essentially?
Okay, and the person next to you.
If state-supported dying becomes available on the NHS, but palliative care and hospices remain largely funded by charities, are we not at risk of creating a two-tiered system where supported dying is available on the NHS, but living with dignity is not?
Mariella.
I guess, first of all, I think that the debate around this issue has been really, really impressive. And I think it speaks volumes for us as a civilized nation that we're having this discussion and that we're having it in the way that we are. And you're right, Hugo Rifkin's column was really, really great. I'm afraid that it doesn't sway me. I don't think it should be a discussion about cost, and I disagree with Rory and indeed Wes Streeting about that. because ultimately it's a moral choice that we all need to make based on our own consciences. I'm an agnostic, and rather than following the teachings of God, it actually makes me want to cling on to every last minute of this life, because I don't think I've got a chance at a second one. My grandmother and now my mother both suffered from dementia. My grandmother died of it. She spent 10 years in a home, not recognising her own daughter. She had no quality of life. My mother is now in the same situation. She doesn't know any of us. An active, clever, inspiring woman is now just a body that's long survived her mind. And it breaks my heart. And I know that she wouldn't want to be in the situation she's in now. And I really feel, for personal reasons, for those personal reasons, that we have a right to choose a dignified exit from this world. I mean, why shouldn't we have that right? You mentioned 2,000 years, Rory, but you know, over those 2,000 years, an awful lot of those societies didn't have laws against assisting dying. So I think it's not a comparison that we can make in that way. And I think it's a really important debate. We are a democracy. I think something like 70% of people believe in people's right to assisted dying, and in the end, it's, you know, it's the democratic vote that should matter, and I think politicians should listen to the electorate.
OK. Anand.
So, I'm not religious. I see myself as being progressive, and I'm very well aware of the fact that under the current system, that not taking a decision is taking a decision, because it leaves loads of people who are in awful suffering, whose suffering could be curtailed in pain. And so there's a lot of me that thinks I should be in favour of this bill, but I can't quite manage it. And I can't quite manage it, I think, for two reasons. I mean, the first, as Rory said, is palliative care. Our palliative care system in this country is rubbish. We don't pay for it properly, there isn't enough of it, there aren't enough beds for people. And by palliative care, what I mean is people who now are suffering, are in pain, are in distress. If we had decent palliative care, they might not be. If we were dealing with their pain better, they might not be. And actually, so I don't want people making decisions because we can't provide good palliative care for them. So that's the first thing. I think that's really important. And the second thing, again, going back to Rory, is I'm pretty convinced that the guarantees in the bill against coercion are about as secure as they could be, but it is the generosity of spirit argument that I don't like. My mum was ill for months. I'm pretty whenever I went to see her, she was in Scotland, she'd say, oh, I'm being such a burden, I'm being such a burden. And looking back on that, I kind of think if she'd had the choice, she'd have gone earlier, and I would have hated that. And I worry about that sort of kindness thing, not people being forced, but people thinking, you know, everyone's having to come here, it's costing them money, I'm a burden on the NHS. And that, I think, that just makes me feel very, very sad. So for those two reasons, even though, I mean, thank God I'm not an MP, so I don't get to vote, but even though I can see there's a strong case, I couldn't quite back it, to be honest.
OK. All right.
Well, can I just say, I just think that, you know, it's a tiny proportion of people who I think will take advantage, if that's the right way of putting it, of this bill. And, you know, I think pitting it against, you know, palliative care. We should have great palliative care, and people should feel that they will be looked after. But should they choose not to, and who knows what... I know what you felt about your mother. I wonder what she felt and what her choice would have been. And I just don't understand, in a civilised world, why we wouldn't have the choice to, to make that decision.
To make that choice. OK. An interesting and thoughtful discussion. Let me take another question now from Ludwig Lupak.
Hi, panel. When tackling the number of people who are not working, is the carrot approach of supporting people into work better than the stick of cutting benefits?
Right, so should we get some statistics out? So the UK is the only major economy where the employment rate has fallen over the last 5 years, mainly because of people out of work with ill health. According to the Office for National Statistics, 11 million working-age people in the UK do not have a paid job. 9.25 of them are economically inactive, which means they're not looking for a job. And 2.8 of those say it's because of long-term sickness. Now, I know the government's made some announcements this week, Lisa, quite a lot about the carrot, I would say, in terms of changes to job centres, mental health, access to mental health care, that kind of thing. Ludwig's question is twofold. It's also about the stick. Do you think there needs to be a stick? And if so, what should it be?
Well, what we announced this week is that you've got nearly 1 million young people who are out of work. They're not in work, they're not in education, they're not in training, which we think is a national scandal. I don't think anyone can be happy with that situation. And you've also got around 2.8 million people who aren't in work because they're too sick to work. Now, one of the ways that you tackle that, obviously, is what we've announced in the budget this week, which is reform and investment into the National Health Service to make sure that people can get access to healthcare in a timely way. It helps businesses, particularly small businesses, because that's a huge cost to them if staff are off work, but it also helps those people to be able to get the opportunities that they want. We make no apology for saying that for those 1 million young people, there has to be a pathway. We've just been debating on this very programme the fact that we're opening the borders to ask people to come in to work in our National Health Service, to work in our creative industries, to work in engineering, to drive our buses. And yet we've got 1 million young people who would kill for those opportunities.
But it's not just young people, Lisa, is it? And you've promised, the government has promised an overhaul of the disability benefit system. It's a review. There's a lot of reviews going on. I think this might be the 7th so far that I've counted.
That's not what we announced this week, Fiona. What we announced this week was that we're going to reform the job centres so that they can look at the individual in front of them.
Well, Liz Kendall, who is the Department for Work and Pensions, talked about a review which will be presented in the spring 25, an overhaul of sickness and disability benefit. I know that you've pledged to stick to the previous government's target of cutting $3 billion from that welfare bill. How are you going to do it?
Well, I will answer your question, but I do really want to address the question.
Well, the question is about carrot and stick. I'm asking what's the stick?
Well, I'm trying to get to it because, people... I feel the frustration all the time. People don't want to know whose fault it was. They want to know how we're going to fix it. And what we announced this week was a plan to fix it. So we're opening up those opportunities. We're partnering with people like Channel 4, the Royal Shakespeare Company, the Premier League, because we've got 25,000 vacancies in the creative industries, and we've got people who would love to work in those things. But like the lady in the audience said, they have to have access to the education, training and opportunities to do it. If people don't take up those opportunities, we have also said that we will not pay benefits to those people. Now, my experience of young people is that they want to work, they want to be in training, they want to be in education, but I do think it's fair to say there is also an obligation to take up those opportunities.
But that happens already.
What I think is really problematic.
Hang on, that happens already.
Yeah, but
if you are offered a job in, if you don't turn up, you can be sanctioned.
Yeah.
So what are you suggesting that's different?
Yeah, so what I think is really problematic is that right now there's a sanction, but there's no opportunity. If you go to the job centre, they have no freedom to look at the person in front of them and decide what the right pathway is and what support can be made available. It's a very rigid system. It's a department for welfare, not a department for work. And we're going to change that by opening up opportunities to people, particularly to young people. We make no apology for that. We think it's a national scandal that 1 million of them are out of work. But you can't just sanction people. You have to provide the opportunities for people to be able to do that. And that's why we're saying investment in the National Health Service, help people off sick pay, back into work, open up opportunities for young people, skills, training and education.
Okay, you've made that
point. I genuinely believe that most people in this country who currently aren't in work but are looking for work will find that absolutely game-changing. You said, is it the carrot or the stick?
And the people who aren't in work and aren't looking for work?
Both.
Because those numbers are staggeringly high.
Well, but there are people, for example, during COVID, during the pandemic, who took early retirement. They decided, actually, I can afford not to work. I don't need to claim my pension yet. I'm not going back to work. We're not going to force people into work if they don't want to be in work and they're self-sufficient. But what we're saying is, if we provide those opportunities and you don't take them, then obviously the country can't. If people work really hard for their wages. There isn't a lot of money in this country. I think people know that at the moment. We've inherited a very poor economic situation.
Said, and you'll introduce a sanction in that case.
And so people have a responsibility to take it up, but I genuinely believe that with those opportunities they will.
Rory.
I feel incredible relief that I'm not in Lisa's position as a government minister having to defend the situation.
Yeah, but you were, and when you were in government, the number of people taking benefits went up and up and up.
No, hugely up. So I think here are two things that I probably wouldn't have felt cheerful saying if I was a government minister. Number one, we're in an unbelievable hole. Right? This is 9.2 million economically inactive people. That's 1 in 7 of people aged under 65 who aren't children. Huge. Secondly, we're complete European outliers. The rest of Europe, this stuff sorted itself after COVID, and we didn't. Thirdly, what I could never really say as a government minister, nobody has really much of a clue why it's happening. It's really weird. Here are some things that we notice, though. 1 in 20 people are on disability benefits in Windsor. Something closer to 1 in 6 are on disability benefits in Blackpool. So it clearly has some connection to poverty, to region. I'd suggest you need to look at what's happening with children too. The number of children with ADHD and autism diagnoses has gone up by 50%. It's a staggering increase. The majority of people claiming personal independence payment at the moment are declaring mental health issues. And if we really step back, part of the problem maybe is that we've created a really rubbish working environment. Jobs are poorly paid, they're extremely stressful. People in Britain work much longer hours than they do in Europe for less money. And therefore, it's not very surprising that 9.2 million people are not very keen to re-enter the workforce.
Anand?
I mean, we don't really know what the stick looks like yet, so it's quite hard to compare the carrot and the stick. I mean, the other thing I'd say before I sort of answer the question is the statistics on this are dreadful. The labour force survey is all over the place, and we just don't have good data about our workforce at the moment. I think
but what we do know is
we know about claimants. We know about people who are claiming...
But we do know that the spending on working age health and disability benefits is projected to rise from 56 billion this year to 75 billion in 2030, which is an astonishing...
No, it is. I mean, we obviously, as Rory said, have a problem in that we're outliers in Europe because I think the amount that we're paying in terms of working age health-related benefits is just shy of what the defence budget is now. I mean, it's huge.
Well, Ludwig's question is the carrot better than the stick?
Well, I think you need a mixture of both. We can't judge government policy yet because we've got the carrot, and I welcome the carrot, the help for mental illness assessment, the Job Centre Plus, all those sort of things. I think the amount of money being talked about is relatively trivial, so I wonder how far that will go. And we can't judge the stickers yet. One of the reasons I think why people actually... one of the obvious differences between us and other European states is our unemployment benefits are relatively mean, which I think actually sometimes pushes people to go towards these health-related benefits to top those things up, because that's one of the variables. Is one of the variables between us and countries like France is they are more generous for out-of-work people. But we have got an issue. I mean, we've got an issue of the labour force, and we've got an issue of health, and particularly, as Rory said, mental health amongst young people. And none of us, I think, really understands why we have it, but it is a serious social and economic problem that we're going to have to deal with.
Mariella?
Well, if only I had a magic wand. I think it's a really, really complex problem. I think mental health provision, needs to be expanded at an enormous scale. And I think that, GPs being given the job of writing people off as whether able to or not able to work because of mental health issues is probably not the right way to do it. You mentioned in my introduction that I was recently appointed by Liz Kendall, the menopause employment ambassador. And, I think that was significant in terms of the government recognising that it's not just, and I'm not really sure why we're so stuck on the million young people, though, of course, they're very important. But we're talking about 9 million people who are economically inactive. 1 in 8 young people, I think, economically inactive, but 1 in 10 women in their 50s leaves the workforce because of lack of support during menopause. It costs us 1.65 billion a year. So, there are really important things that can be done in terms of supporting people back into work in areas that you might not necessarily think are the most obvious ones. But I also think, there's a cultural problem. I think there's a problem of negativity in society, a sense that you can't get on even if you want to. I don't think that the numbers, Blackpool, I think you compared to Windsor, are surprising because I think those are areas where there's desperate economic hardship. Okay. I think there's a lot of young men, in particular, who are targeted by social media. I mean, my son showed me the other day, every third, he's 19 years old, every third TikTok he gets is some guy kind of going, hey, losers go out to jobs. You know, what you need to do is listen to my 5-point plan. You know, you need to invest in crypto and you need to... And I think actually a lot of kids sit at home and look at their phones and watch other people make money and think that they're going to do it. And so I think we actually need to look at that and the fact that young men in particular feel disenfranchised by the fact that now, happily, more young women are getting into work and pursuing careers, and they feel that equality hasn't been good to them. So we need to deal with all of the mythology that swirls
I want to try and get one more question in, so I want you to be, Jacob, if you wouldn't mind being reasonably brief on what was obviously a very important topic.
I'll do my best. I think this ties in fundamentally with the question on immigration, and that we have left behind in this country, by taking in cheap labour from abroad, the least well-off in this society. We have a productivity problem going back to about the year 2000. We have constantly thought the answer is to get in cheap labour from abroad, and we have left behind those at the bottom of society. We haven't given them the training they've needed, and wages haven't risen as they should have done for people in some of the low-skilled entry jobs. That has meant people have looked at benefits and looked at work and seen that benefits are a reasonable option compared to work. That is a major problem. We then, after COVID, took away many of the sanctions. So the economically inactive, the 9.25 million, it was about 9 million in 2010. It fell to 8 million, and it's risen post-COVID to 9.25 million as the sanctions were taken away. Of course you need to have a stick as well as a carrot. You need to have tests on people's health. The number of people who are unwell has tripled. Do we really think society's got 3 times less well in the last couple of years? I just think that's not believable. And so you absolutely need to test people, you need to check, but you need a fundamental change in our economic outlook that increases productivity, allows people to get better paid jobs, and that goes back to controlling migration.
Okay. Let me squeeze in this last question. Forgive me for not coming at you for that, because quite a few people asked about this, so I thought, well, let's go for it. Farah Glanville. Oh, there you are.
Hi, good evening. Has Band-Aid done more harm than good in Africa, as Fuse ODG has claimed and has been implied by Ed Sheeran?
Right, so listen, just a very quick bit of background. Band-Aid's put out a new single for the 40th anniversary of the very first one. Ed Sheeran was not happy about his vocals being used, and he said his understanding of the narrative has changed, and if asked, he respectfully would not have wanted them on there. And Fuse ODG, who's a British Ghanaian rapper and musician, says the song perpetuates damaging stereotypes, plays into a kind of persistently negative portrayal of Africa as a continent, as opposed to as somewhere where you could go, you could invest, you could go as a tourist, you could, he's just saying it's a kind of blanket negative stereotype. Rory?
So, extreme poverty in Africa has risen from 130 million people in 1980 to 470 million people today. And in percentage terms, it hasn't dropped much, but in absolute terms, it's shot up. These are people living on less than $2 a day. They're struggling to feed themselves once a day, once every 2 days in some cases. They have very, very poor indicators on almost everything. And there's a solution. And that solution is facing us. Unconditional direct cash transfer. Very radical, but evidence is coming in from 400 academic studies on how much difference it can make. We have enough money in international development in the world to end extreme poverty within a generation. And the reason we're not doing it is that we have a patronizing, complacent, bureaucratic industry where we're paying ourselves salaries, driving around in vehicles, lecturing people in villages, rather than respecting their dignity, their freedom, and giving them the cash to improve their lives.
We're all going to be brief, I'm not going to get the audience in. Anand, briefly. I mean, I should just say, incidentally, that the Band-Aid Charitable Trust has raised almost 150 million, and there are plenty of people who've spoken out in support of it, but I'm just giving you both sides there. Anand.
Well, let me start by saying I was at Live Aid and felt very virtuous about the whole day, but, I mean, subsequently, I suppose, I wouldn't criticise the people because I think that money is necessary and is needed, but there has been some negative stereotyping. There has been an element of white saviorism in the way that the developed world looks upon the developing world. And in a way, this takes us back to our first question. If we don't stabilise the developing world, if we don't help protect them against the threat of climate change, if we don't give them safe, secure societies, you know what they're going to do? they're going to leave and they're going to come to places like this. So ultimately, it is in our interest to do more. And I wouldn't, I think Band-Aid was fine, but we should be doing more, and we should be more to make them more
Really quick, because we've got 4 minutes left. Did you do the PR for the first?
I did the PR for
first
Band-Aid
single,
and for Live Aid,
and
not
for Live Aid.
single-handedly,
No,
obviously
sure.
as part of a large
So what do you,
team.
just very briefly, Mariella, where do you stand on this debate?
Well, I think, first of all, I think that we've learnt a lot, and I think that there's a huge case for investment in Africa rather than money, charitable money being handed out. I think that we failed badly with promising 0.7% and then not living up to it in terms of international development money. But ultimately, there's a famine in Sudan at the moment. There are children starving to death. And I don't think any single one of them, or the kids that go up to Bob Geldof when he travels to Africa, and I've been to many of the places where that money's been invested, and kids come up and say they wouldn't be alive if it hadn't been for what he'd done. And I'd rather his legacy than Ed Sheeran's worrying about what he's going to say at dinner parties, when actually there are children starving and they need the money.
Woman in the grey top there. Yes.
Hi, so I'm Nigerian and I actually go Africa quite frequently, and it has changed. It's actually very beautiful, a lovely place to tour. I go home quite often, and I'm not denying the work that Band-Aid does, but my question is, why do we need to hold on to this narrative that we are struggling and, we need this help? And granted, we probably do, but we are evolving, so why can't that song reflect that?
OK, Jacob.
Well, Rory mentioned the very important absolute poverty figure. Globally, from 1990 to now, it's gone from 50% down to 10%. And that's really important because that's been China and India coming into the trading world. What we need is to help those economies. That's investment. It's also going to be removing all trade barriers. But charity, and here I completely agree with Mariella, is a wonderful thing. When people are starving and somebody in this country is going to stand up on stage and say, let's give them some money, that is admirable, and I much prefer it being private charity than being done by the taxpayer. When individuals want to give off their own bat, I think that's completely admirable and should never be criticised.
Hang on, Mariella. I've got about 2 minutes. I want to get 2 more responses. Yes.
Yes. I think there are good opportunities in Africa now. We've seen successful examples of investment in microfinance that has made massive differences. And after Brexit now, I thought the idea was to partner with Commonwealth countries, and the opportunities there. The Chinese are stealing a march on the West, and we've got opportunity there to do lots of good and little costs.
So you've got the points made very powerfully there that, there are places that are absolutely thriving. They've got Mariella's point, yes, but there are places that absolutely aren't.
Yeah, I think that's right, but I think the point that Ed Sheeran was making, and he made it in quite a respectful way, is that I think times have moved on and our understanding of Africa in particular has moved on in this country. And
so do you think they shouldn't have brought out this song again?
No, I don't want to, like Anand, I don't want to criticise people who were well-intentioned and were doing something that had an enormous difference at the time. But actually, I was in Zambia last year talking to African leaders about what they want and need from countries like the UK. They are the most climate affected in the world, and they're having to pay huge costs to deal with that. They've also got historic levels of debt on very, very poor terms, so they spend almost 100% of their national income on servicing that debt. And that means they can't escape the triple doom loop of climate, poverty and debt. Now, we have an obligation to support those countries, but not one of them asked me for charity. What they want is our help in renegotiating the terms of that debt. They want our help collectively as a world to come together and tackle climate change. That's what our international development policy aims to do. And I think what that does is unlock the enormous potential across the African continent and benefits every single one of us.
It's not either or, is it? That's the thing. It's not either or. Of course, we need investment. Parts of Africa are doing far better than we are, quite frankly, and it should be recognised. But at the same time, there is a famine in Sudan. And if I can provide money that will help a child or a family live, I'll do it. I'm
going to have to end it here because we're out of time, forgive me. And I'm sorry to those of you who had your hand up. There are loads more that I didn't get to. That's all for this week. Remember, we've got our programme in Lincoln next week with a terrific panel, as well as the one we had today. That's all from us. See you next week.